There's now a way to contact the Wolf Connection podcast. Send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Calfa. Let's talk about some wolves. We're going to get started here, and we have a very important guest with Stephen, who's actually here on site with me. This person's coming to us from Logan, Utah. He's an associate professor at Utah State University. He is a co-author of 2 books, Wolves on the Hunt, The Behavior of Wolves Hunting Wild Prey, along with Doug Smith and David Meach, and the newest book concerning wolves in Yellowstone Wolves, which also is it's a science. It's right behind me. I mean, you guys can't see it, but it's on my shelf. We go through it a lot. He is Professor Dan MacNulty. Dan, pleasure to have you here. How's everything going in Utah and so on and so forth in your daily life right now?
Things are great. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak with you and Steve and your audience. So thanks for having me. Yeah,
Stephen, I want you to kick off because 2 episodes ago, if those of you that are avid listeners to the podcast or if you're just checking in now, we did a recap essentially of wolf news that was happening right now. And Stephen had quoted a major portion of an article, Dan, that you were a part of. And we were just, as we were talking beforehand, you're on this information campaign to really get the good, solid information and data out to people that might not necessarily read these articles. So Stephen, just go through what you read, and then Dan, please comment on what really proposed you to go on this journey.
Yeah, we were, I'm if you listen to that last episode, I believe it was episode, what did you say it was, 64?
64, yeah.
Yeah, so episode 64, where we kind of did that breakdown episode, sort of a newscast-esque episode of just the rundown of the current state of wolf affairs. And I pulled about 20 articles, but I ended up really using a lot of the stuff from this onescience.org article where Dan MacNulty is included in there. And if you guys remember, I was talking about how Montana wanted to reduce elk numbers from about 142,000 to 92,000. So a big jump, but they've also embraced the killing of a predator that could help them achieve that goal. And their management objectives, MacNulty notes, are at a cross purpose. I found so much of that article really interesting, but how did you get involved in that article? And can you just give a breakdown of your involvement in at least the information that's presented there?
Right. So that was an article that was written by Virginia Morell. She's a freelance journalist. She writes a lot for Science Magazine, and she's covered some of my work in the past and contacted me for other news articles about Yellowstone wolves in the past. And so she reached out to me shortly after the new year, asking me questions about the hunt in Montana, and specifically about wolves, Yellowstone wolves being hunted and trapped outside of the park. And what really kind of kicked this off, I think, including for Virginia, I don't know specifically, but I'm guessing, is that Matt Brown with the Associated Press published a piece, I think it was around January 6th, releasing information from a Freedom of Information Act request, in which he documented that as many as 20 wolves, I think at that time, I can't remember the specific number, total number of Yellowstone wolves that had been killed as a result of hunting and trapping in the surrounding states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. And so that was sort of the news article that kind of got everyone to sit up on their seat, like, whoa, large numbers of wolves, Yellowstone wolves specifically, historically large numbers of Yellowstone wolves were being killed by hunters. And that really got my attention. I remember reading that Matt Brown piece and being like, oh man, this is more than just, a handful, which is what we've been dealing with really since wolves were delisted in the surrounding states. Every year it's been a handful, 6 or less basically across the different states. But now we're talking 20. Right now the number stands at 25. And that hits home for me because I study that population. I'm trying to understand what the ecological consequences of wolf reintroduction are. And from a very practical point of view, I have to deal now with the fact that not only are wolves killing elk and other things, but hunters are killing the wolves, and that really complicates the picture in terms of what's happening with the ecology of the system. So anyway, Virginia reached out to me for comment, and I realized just how little I understood about the details of the different hunts that are going on in the different states, because so much of it has changed really recently. So Montana, starting last spring, their state legislature introduced a series of bills that really opened up and expanded the number of ways in which hunters and trappers can kill wolves. Idaho has done similar things, perhaps even more draconian, in the sense that they don't even have a season on wolves. It's year round now that you hunt wolves in Idaho. And I just started getting into the details of this, and I was giving Virginia as much information as I could, but her piece was pretty short because it was just a little news feature, and there was a lot more to be said. And so I've been sort of a Twitter skeptic and have not done much on Twitter or really social media much beyond just talking with journalists from all my career. I've been at this for about 27 years now. And I realized that Twitter is just a great opportunity to get information out, information that I was uncovering in the process of answering Virginia's questions and questions from other journalists. Because I spoke to a journalist from Radio Canada, another journalist from Holland, and I just felt like there was more information that I was giving them that was actually getting into their pieces. And so that's why I started that Twitter feed, to just sort of get that information out there. If you read the feed, you'll notice that I'm not really making any grand proclamations or maybe even leveling much in the sense of opinion. I'm just basically reporting out, what has been published in scientific articles, trying to bring the raw data to people's attention, just so people understand what the situation is in terms of what the data are telling us. And so that's really the goal of that Twitter feed.
So in this science.org article as well, I'm just curious, this number, 142,000 to 92,000, where did you find that information? Where did you source those numbers from? And from wherever you sourced them, what were the reasons given for why Montana would want to reduce their elk population that much, especially in a state where the guiding industry, I'm assuming, is one of the top industries in the state?
Yeah, recreation makes up a big part of the economy of the state of Montana, and not just hunting, but all forms, non-consumptive wildlife uses as well. So the information on those elk population objectives, that comes directly from the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks website. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is an exceptionally professional organization, really full of experts in all areas, wildlife, large mammals, wolves in particular, and they have an outstanding GIS staff. And so what's great about Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is a lot of their data is geospatial, and they make it publicly available, either as PDFs or actually interactive maps online. And so there's a lot of information that's just on their website that is immensely useful for kind of putting together the picture of what's happening with wolves with respect to the other management priorities in the state of Montana. So whether that's elk population objectives, dealing with chronic wasting disease, harvest of other large carnivores, including cougars, it's all there, but it's not necessarily, they're not necessarily advertising it. And then even if someone were to access that, they might not necessarily know how to interpret it and how to put it together. And so that's what I've been trying to do, is just kind of connect the dots. I'm not really creating the dots necessarily, but I'm just trying to connect that information that's already out there in a way that provides context for what's actually happening on the ground. So all that data is from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the deal is that there are too many elk in the state of Montana as a whole. There are some regions that have way too many elk, and there's arguably, one or two regions where people will argue there's not enough elk. Region 1 in particular, in the upper northwest corner of the state. But as a state as a whole, there are about, I think, 50,000 more elk than they need with respect to their population objectives, and a lot of that is driven by the fact that there's a lot of elk that will range on the private lands that aren't accessible to hunters because the owners of those private lands don't necessarily allow hunters access to those properties to hunt. So that's a big part of the conundrum. That's not always the case, but that's part of it. There are also some areas that are public lands that are over objective. But the idea of using wolves to help, reduce number of elk in those areas where they are over objective, that, as far as I can tell, hasn't really gotten much attention. And that strikes me as odd because, I've spent a lot of time examining the effects of wolves on the population dynamics of the northern Yellowstone elk herd, which spends its summers inside the park, and much of the population then migrates outside of the park into southwest Montana in the wintertime, and it occupies an area, a hunting district called 313. So I've really been looking at that interaction between wolves and those elk, and then also hunters and those elk, because those elk, when they migrate across the boundary, they get hunted by hunters in Montana. And really the take-home message about that is that in order for that population to have declined as it did, required the work of both wolves and hunters, because prior to wolf reintroduction, they had a really difficult time controlling that elk herd. It kept growing and growing and growing. And it wasn't until really we had a lot of wolves on the ground working basically together with hunters that they were actually able to drive that population down. And so the northern Yellowstone herd outside Montana is actually at objective. It's where it should be based on the state's elk management plan. So my thought is like, well, why don't you apply that same sort of model to some of these other objectives? Now it's tricky because, you do have private lands and maybe you have livestock, which isn't compatible with wolves necessarily. But surely there are some units, hunting districts, where they might be able to be creative about using both wolves and hunters to sort of drive elk numbers down to reach those population objectives. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there's really the Montana law says that the Wildlife Commission is mandated to manage for elk numbers that are either at or below objective. It doesn't say anything in the law that these units have to be above objective. In fact, it says the exact opposite, at or below. I mean, that's in the Montana code. And so there's a real legal incentive, I think, on the part of the Montana Wildlife Commission to look for creative ways to bring those elk numbers down. And I think they're missing an opportunity by overlooking the help that wolves could provide to bring those numbers down in conjunction with hunters. And that's the thing that people forget or don't even appreciate. They think about wolves and hunters as sort of like opponents. And what I'm saying is that no, actually they're allies. They can work together to achieve management objectives. We're talking about reducing elk numbers where they're over objective. But there's also the issue of chronic wasting disease, which is spreading in Montana. That's a severe issue. And by reducing wolf numbers in areas where chronic wasting disease is spreading is possibly exacerbating the problem. We just published a study with Ellen Brendel. She was the lead author. It was a simulation study that showed that under realistic circumstances, predation pressure from wolves could in fact reduce the spread of chronic wasting disease. Not only just wolves, but also cougars as well, mountain lions. And there was an article that was posted in the Washington Post just yesterday about mountain lion hunting in Montana. Governor of Montana killed a radio-collared mountain lion that had been living inside Yellowstone and dispersed outside. What that article drew attention to in a somewhat subtle way is that large numbers of mountain lions are actually also killed in Montana annually. Totally legal. I think the Fish, Wildlife, and Park spokesman said that over 500 cougars were killed just in 2020 alone. And so by killing large numbers of predators in areas where you have too many elk and you have chronic wasting disease spreading, that's a missed opportunity to attempt a creative way to deal with those issues. Maintain your predators in that area and see if that helps. At least try and manage predators in those areas to at least attempt to reduce the spread of chronic wasting disease. We don't know if it's going to work because there hasn't been any empirical data that has shown this, but they're in a position to actually test it if they were just to maintain predator numbers in those areas where chronic wasting disease is spreading.
Yeah. You've laid out so much information just in that answer, and you answered some of my questions I was just going to ask you. And to go back from what Dan said earlier, so the number as of right now, as you said, is 25 wolves from Yellowstone that have been killed, which is 20% of the population, which is a huge number. So obviously, that is something that draws a lot of attention from the general public because those wolves are at the forefront. So people know about these wolves. They're posted about a lot from a lot of the people that we've met when we went to Yellowstone, and so they're on the forefront. In terms of what you were saying, and if you can elaborate a little bit more, is I was going to ask about CWD, and chronic wasting disease has been pushing its way across, and now it is in the West and in Montana. And in that, I didn't realize about the cougar numbers too that were so high, that they've been killing that many mountain lions and cougars. So with that, because you study and your lab and all the studies that you do at Utah State are really based in the food web structure, the ecosystem function. So how does that break down out in the wild in the Yellowstone area that you guys study, where, like you say, we're taking away an asset, it seems, by going full bore, swinging the pendulum one way to eradicate or decimate the wolf populations to a point where they can't really weed out these sick elk, these sick ungulates that'll just start infecting the rest of the populations as they move across the West.
I think the word that you use that I'd like to underline is the word asset. I think that is an important word for describing the ecological potential of wolves and their usefulness for management. They are an asset ecologically. And what I'm afraid of, because I understand how permanent chronic wasting disease is. I mean, once it's in an area, it's there for basically forever, as the studies from Colorado have shown. Like, once you get chronic wasting disease in a population, it doesn't go away. And it has profound consequences. For example, in Wyoming now, where chronic wasting disease has spread up from Colorado, they have a program in place where hunters can donate their meat to food pantries. And I thought that was really interesting. I started reading some of the details, and what I learned is that there's concern about some of those donated carcasses having chronic wasting disease. And so, they have to test every carcass to make sure it doesn't have chronic wasting disease before they provide that carcass to the food pantry. So this is also a human health issue as well for hunters and for people who eat hunter-killed animals. And what I'm afraid of is that we're eliminating an opportunity potentially to stem the spread of chronic wasting disease by unnecessarily killing excessive numbers of wolves and cougars. And when I say unnecessarily, what I mean is that, for example, like outside northern Yellowstone National Park, elk numbers are at objective. Livestock conflict is inconsequential outside northern Yellowstone. There's really no reason the park boundary. That's the total number of Yellowstone wolves that have crossed the northern boundary that have been killed in units 316, 313, and then I think, it's just those two units. In the past, we've also lost wolves to Unit 390, which is a little further north. But there's no reason for those wolves, from a management standpoint, to be eliminated. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. There's no logical reason for it. There's a lot of logic, a lot of science, a lot of rational argument for why you would want to maintain those animals in order to stem the tide of say, chronic wasting disease into Yellowstone, or maintain elk numbers at or below objective as Montana law requires. And then that's to say nothing about the economic impacts that these wolves, or the economic benefits that these wolves have. I mean, they contribute massively to the local economy. People come from abroad to see wolves in Yellowstone. It's a worldwide phenomenon, as you guys know. So it's frankly madness, as far as I'm concerned, to be killing that number of wolves. It's a waste of a precious resource, is really what it is. And then the third sort of part of this is the educational costs. Wolves in Yellowstone are the source of a lot of education, both in terms of public education to visitors, but also there are large numbers of students. I was one of them that come through Yellowstone. They study wolves. They're collecting data on these animals. You lose a collared wolf, and you're basically losing an educational opportunity. And so there's a lot of costs associated with the killing of each of these individual Yellowstone wolves that crosses the boundary, that I don't think the decision makers in the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commission are either appreciative of, or perhaps even just aware of. And so that's another part of sort of my hope, and what I'm doing is just trying to get the information out that will hopefully penetrate their minds so they can use this information to make better decisions, at least about the wolves that surround northern Yellowstone National Park. And so, there's a business coalition based in Gardner, Montana, the Wild Business Coalition, I think it's called. And it's a variety of different businesses that have basically come together to argue for and really demand a reinstatement of the restricted quotas in those two hunting districts, 313 and 316. For years, it was like 2 or 3 wolves. And now, it was basically unrestricted up to, they could take it. I mean, theoretically, they could have taken as many as 82 wolves. If 82 wolves had crossed the boundary and there were enough people to kill them, they could have taken that number. But as it turned out, it was 19. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, of course. I have 2 questions back to back. So
yeah,
then you're up. So is there these are, I'm going to pose two arguments that I hear people give quite often, and I just want to know your thoughts on them. Is there any merit, do you feel, to the argument that we should not be treating Yellowstone wolves as individuals, meaning like separate from the species level population, or are they different?
Okay, let's make sure I understand. So you're saying, and I understand one component of what you said, which is there's a lot of value placed on individual wolves, like
meaning we should not be treating Yellowstone wolves as if they belong to the park, because in terms of population and in terms of the importance of population, the best way to approach it is how are wolves doing in Montana versus how are wolves that belong to the Yellowstone Park doing, and then when they leave the park, are they still Yellowstone wolves? And where does that kind of lead us that we would treat a certain subpopulation of wolves as different from the larger population of the species?
So there's a lot of ways to address that question, and it's a great question. And all those different ways really depend on your point of view. So, for example, if I'm a wildlife manager with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or if I'm a wildlife commissioner, what I'm concerned about is making sure that there are enough wolves in the state of Montana, enough breeding pairs, that the state of Montana doesn't lose management authority over those wolves because they are relisted as an endangered and threatened species. So Montana, as well as Idaho and Wyoming, have agreed to maintain a certain number of wolves, as a certain number of breeding pairs, which are basically packs, as a condition of keeping those wolves off the endangered species list, and as a condition of those states managing those wolves and having management authority over those wolves. So from the state management perspective, they're focused on just having, enough wolves and enough breeding pairs to keep the wolves from being relisted. And so they don't really, from that point of view, it doesn't really make any difference to them whether, 10 Yellowstone wolves get shot or 2 get shot or trapped. As long as there's enough wolves overall in the state of Montana, that's all they care about. And the other sort of layer of nuance to be aware of is that most of Yellowstone is actually inside Wyoming, and packs of wolves that live in Yellowstone actually contribute to Wyoming's recovery standard, not to Montana. So if Montana hunters they eliminate a wolf pack, they eliminate, for example, the Phantom Lake pack this season, that's one less pack that helps Wyoming meet its recovery standard of 15 breeding pairs and 150 wolves. So what's happening in Montana is a little bit of a concern for the folks in Wyoming. Now, granted, what Wyoming has presently, I think as of 2020, outside of the national parks and the Wind River Reservation, I forgot what it was, but I think they had something like, 14 breeding pairs and something like, 200 wolves or something. I can't remember the exact number. Actually, I do. It's right here. Come and think of it. At 2020, I don't have that number. 2020, they had 13 breeding pairs and 183 wolves, and that's outside Yellowstone and outside the Wind River Reservation. So, but if, let's say in 2021, they drop to, say, 10 breeding pairs, and then Yellowstone, maybe there's a massive disease outbreak in Yellowstone, like a canine distemper virus outbreak, which we've had in Yellowstone, and that drops numbers of wolves in Yellowstone. Well, all of a sudden, Wyoming is in a bit of a bind if Montana hunters are picking off packs that are crossing the northern boundary. Okay, so I think I've kind of given you a sense for what the state manager perspective is, and then there's the perspective of people who come to the park to watch wolves. They're there to see their favorite packs, their favorite individuals. And for them, that state point of view is really irrelevant because they're paying thousands of dollars to see individual wolves, and that's their experience, right? And so that's kind of where the rubber meets the road for them. And then you have maybe the Park Service perspective, which is a perspective in which they are mandated by the 1916 Organic Act, which is really their mandate to preserve natural processes unimpaired, unimpaired. And so they're concerned about, well, is the removal of wolves outside of northern Yellowstone or anywhere outside of the park, is that impairing natural processes inside the park? Okay. And so they're worried about that. So in that, and maybe the individual question, maybe that's not as relevant there. And maybe that's just primarily relevant from the park visitor standpoint. But you can see how you have different groups of stakeholders that really have different perspectives on the value of individuals relative to the value of populations. Hopefully that's helpful.
No, it is. And I want to jump in, just piggyback on that, and then I'll hand the floor back to Stephen. So this is when I sent the outline to you, I know there was one question that you were a little bit, when I said difference between scientific breeding pairs and legislative breeding pairs. And what I meant was sort of tongue in cheek in that, like what you just said, we have certain numbers that have been laid out vis-a-vis, Endangered Species Act, all these different acts saying these are the numbers that people go back to, these governors, these senators, these legislative bodies that say, well, we have 150 wolves, 10 breeding pairs, 15 breeding pairs, and that is the bare maximum or minimum or whatever they say that needs to be. And that when we go federally or individually or scientifically, we say that's not a basis for recovery. Because if we just have the bare minimum, that's not going to be considered a recovery or a sustainable population moving forward. So what's the actual numbers that need to be there, if you can even answer this?
Yeah, and also this was my next question. This is my next question, so I don't need to ask it anymore. But yeah, that was my question. Was I've tried to become clear on this, but it seemed vague in the past, and maybe the official answer. I don't know, but that 150 number, was that meant to be, again, because this is another point of interest that is heavily focused on folks who don't want to see an abundance of wolves on the landscape, is that, well, you promised 150, why are there 1,100 now? And how can you explain to us why you're now trying to get rid of our ability to lethally manage when we're incredibly over that 150 number? So the question was that 150 number meant to be this is a successful reintroduction, or this is the bare minimum that we promised to have on the landscape?
Well, let me try to walk you through the history of this, and I'm sure I'm going to put people to sleep. But I think I've been refreshing my memory on these questions too, Stephen, because when you're reading, the governor of Wyoming citing these numbers, or when I'm reading it, it's light bulbs are going off. I'm thinking to myself, is that right? That doesn't really make sense. And so I've been digging into the delisting rules themselves for the history on this. And that's really the best source of information on the facts related to recovery and what the legal expectations are by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And some of these links I think might be on my Twitter page, but if not, I can forward them to you guys, and you can take a look at this. And it might seem like dry reading, but it's actually really informative. So it originally started in 1987, as far as the record is concerned. The 1987, it's a Fish and Wildlife Service document that laid out the idea that in order to have wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies, we need to have 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves in each of the 3 states, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Okay. 10 breeding pairs, 100 wolves in each of those 3 states. Okay, so for a total of 30 breeding
10
pairs
breeding
and 300
pairs in
wolves.
each. Okay.
In each
Got
state.
It. Yeah.
Okay, for a total of 30 breeding pairs and 300 wolves. That was in 1987. Fish and Wildlife Service revisited that in 1994, and they said, you know what, that might not be enough. That might be too much of a bare minimum, and so we're gonna have a buffer. We're gonna say no, not 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves in each state. We're gonna say 15 breeding pairs and 150 wolves in each of the 3 states. Okay. And so where did those numbers come from? Did it come from some sort of scientific analysis, some sort of quantitative modeling, statistical analysis? It did not. It came from the Fish and Wildlife Service surveying a number of wolf experts around the world here in the United States. I think they cite 45 different people with knowledge about wolves. So it was based on expert opinion. Okay. And that's a legitimate approach. Certainly when you're dealing with perhaps a lack of data to do the kind of modeling that would be necessary to give you sort of a quantitative answer to that question, how many do you need for recovery? And so they canvassed and surveyed these different biologists, and they initially said, the 10 breeding pair and 100 wolves, and then they came back and said, well, let's be conservative by, let's say 15 breeding pairs and 150 for each of the 3 states. And so that's where that came from. But the other important part is that it isn't an absolute minimum. What they said is at least 15 breeding pairs, at least 150 wolves in each of the 3 different states. Okay. So it was never envisioned that the states would manage at those thresholds. And in fact, there is a real reason for the states not to manage at that threshold, because if they, if numbers of breeding pairs and number of wolves is reduced below those thresholds, it kicks in scrutiny by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They'll do what's called a status review, which is actually what's happening right now, where the Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing the status of these populations to see whether or not they're at risk of needing to be relisted again, because there have been calls to relist wolves. And there's sort of 3 criteria that is in the delisting rule for Idaho and Montana for why they would do a status review. One is if the numbers of breeding pairs and the numbers of wolves in any of the 3 states dipped below 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves in any given year. That's one. A second is if the numbers of breeding pairs and numbers of wolves dropped below 15 and 150 for 3 consecutive years. That's the second criteria that would trigger a review. And then the third is if there's any sort of change in the state laws or regulations that might reduce protections for wolves in those states. That's the other reason why a status review might occur. And that's, I don't know for a fact because I haven't read this, but I believe that's probably the trigger that has led to the current status review, that you had Idaho and Montana, they passed these laws that were much more permissive to the killing of wolves by hunters and trappers. And that set off that third criteria, a change in state laws or regulations that triggered the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, to conduct this current status review that is ongoing. So hopefully that's helpful, Stephen.
Yeah, that was definitely what I was trying to get at. I wanted to put that to bed because we have talked about it a lot, but we never. I don't know. I was listening to something else where someone was saying, "Well, the reality is they promised it wouldn't go beyond 150," and I was thinking
that's not true.
Like, that would be an unreasonable promise. So
right.
I have a feeling there's something else.
It's just it's factually incorrect because
Also,
the law says greater than it says specifically at least 150, at least 15 breeding pairs in each of the 3 states. It's going to be some number greater than that. It's not going to be exactly that. And so
it's a major distinction.
Yeah. I mean, so how does the number, because Stephen has asked this question multiple times, and we've been looking and doing research too. Why does the language get so muddied and grayed out? Is it just because people are trying to score points, be it politically or whatever it may be, to serve a certain agenda? Because these numbers, again, like you said, and I read the article that you posted on your Twitter in terms of Wyoming. What is the gain? Because to us, it seems as though you're hurting the populace, not only of the wolves first and foremost, but also the inhabitants of these states. In terms of, I mean, if we're talking about Montana, Wyoming specifically, you're talking about tourism dollars and business dollars that seem to be predicated upon the fact that wolves are there. What is the end game? Because it seemed as though, like you said, these legislative measures were passed and they were so far in one direction that it almost seemed as though it was an ask for a review to happen.
I think that a certain amount of this is motivated by a lack of information, a lack of understanding, a lack of translation of the existing science that's been produced by people like me and many others. There's a whole industry out there of academics and their students that are cranking out publications about wolves and large carnivores. And yet my sense is that much of that is basically ignored, or the decision makers are unaware of it. Okay. And instead what the people that they're hearing from, the people that the wildlife commissions are hearing from, are the hunting organizations, the livestock organizations. They may not be listening to their experts in their agencies. The experts in the agencies might not necessarily be aware of all the latest research. And so I think that, honestly, I think there's a certain amount of ignorance, honestly, that's fueling a lot of the decisions. For example, Paul Fielder, who is the Montana state legislator who is responsible for some of the legislation that passed the Montana legislature last spring, was signed by the governor. If you listen to his remarks when he's explaining his bill that would permit some of these, snares and so forth of wolves, he made a comment about how there are no wolves in these areas where we have elk above population objective, and that's clearly not the case. There are places where they're harvesting wolves, they're hunting and trapping wolves, where elk numbers are exceeding population objective. And so, why did he say that? It could be he just didn't know that there is actual overlap between wolves in certain areas and where they're over objective. So I think there's some of that. You go to the example of the Wyoming governor, who's saying, the federal government and peer reviewers told us that 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves is a recovery objective, a recovery criteria. He may have been misinformed, or the people that were informing him were misinformed, because unless you are familiar with the history, or if you take the time to familiarize yourself with the history, you may not know that it's greater than, at least 10 breeding pairs, at least 100. And the other thing about Wyoming that's different from Montana and Idaho is that the recovery objective for Wyoming is specific to areas outside Yellowstone National Park and the Wind River Reservation, okay? Because the state doesn't have jurisdiction over those two areas. And in addition, the delisting rule for Wyoming says specifically that Wyoming will manage for some buffer, some extra number of wolves larger than that 10 breeding pairs and 100, right? So Wyoming is actually on the hook for a larger number of wolves and breeding pairs than what the governor is saying in that comment. He may not have been aware of that. His people may not have been aware of that, because unless you read the delisting rule, you're not going to know it. Unless you read the Wyoming, Montana, or the Wyoming wolf management plan, you're not going to be aware of it. So, I think there is some of that. And so the only way to deal with that, to neutralize that, is just by continuing to get information out, and hopefully it will penetrate those people, because Wyoming has zero, they benefit. Let me rephrase this. There is no practical benefit to Wyoming for having numbers of wolves that are right at that bare minimum, because that risks relisting. That risks federal management of wolves in the state of Wyoming. That means that the state of Wyoming will have zero management authority over wolves in that state. And so, the last thing that I would want if I was a wildlife manager in the state of Wyoming is to bring that wolf population down to such an extent that I risk losing management authority. Like, that is a worst case scenario, because all of a sudden I can't, if someone's cow gets killed by a wolf, I can't go in there and kill that wolf and deal with that situation. I'm going to have to be waiting for the federal government, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, Wildlife Services, to make that call, right?
They're totally disempowered.
Yeah, it really complicates my life. And so, if you think it through, you realize quite quickly that, managing for that bare minimum is just really inviting difficulty, honestly.
Yeah. But speaking of that, and you're mentioning that, it brings up something that I was wondering about before, which is that's how I felt when I first heard that their new objective now was to cull like 90% of the wolves. And I'm thinking, isn't this like explosion of sort of, isn't taking this extreme position, adopting this extreme position, isn't this inevitably going to lead you to the one place you don't want to go to, which is prompting special protections? I mean, why weren't they, I guess, a little less out front about it? I mean, I couldn't understand why they would risk that, because that's the first thought that I had. Even now, I mean, maybe they wouldn't have wanted to do it in the past either, keep it at 150, but now they're at 1100 and they're talking about bringing it back to 150. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't that just bringing you to the one place you don't want to be at, which is not able to have power over this scenario at all?
And it's not even that too. And I'll piggyback on that. It's the public perception that's going to come down from not just the surrounding areas, but worldwide. I mean, this is something that
it was like nobody thought of it. Like, oh, if we adopt a position this extreme and we're loud about it, we're just begging for this to be a problem for us in the very near future. And I couldn't understand why they'd risk it.
Yeah. So I can only imagine that they see it as politically advantageous amongst their constituents to be anti-wolf, because, it's sort of wolves are seen as being the cause of, progressives, liberals, etc., who represent minorities in these states. And so being anti-wolf is possibly a benefit to these politicians. So we have the reason that we talked about earlier, which is, well, maybe they just don't understand facts in terms of biology, that there are actually too many elk, not, it isn't a problem of too few, but too many. So that's one thing. And then you have questions or maybe misunderstandings about what the law actually says. That's number two. And then number three might be, they're sort of trying to score political points with their constituents. And that's all speculation, because honestly, on my part, because in order to really get a good answer, you would have to go talk to some of these folks. And what you guys should do, to be honest with you, you should reach out to Paul Fielder, who's the congressman in Montana, who represents Region 1, and then Brown, I can't remember his first name. Bob Brown, maybe it might be. He's the state senator from that area. Yeah, and talk to them, because. And then here's another idea too, because the other sort of component of this are the hunter organizations, and keep in mind there's a wide spectrum of sort of politics and personalities among you have some groups that are actually reimbursing hunters and trappers for the expenses they incur while hunting and trapping for wolves. So if I spend, $100 in gas in trapping a wolf, I can submit my receipt to an organization called Foundation for Wildlife Management, and they'll reimburse me. So it's a bit of a sort of a de facto bounty system. And the guy there, you can find him online, and bring him on and find out, what his point of view is. I think that could be really constructive, because it's important to understand where these people are coming from, because they have firmly held views. And it's important to understand what those views are. And just like you're talking to me, I think it could be really revealing to talk to one of them, find out where they're coming from, because it doesn't make sense. And a lot of these people that are anti-predator, anti-wolf, it's not like, these are smart folks, and so the question is, well, why do they think that? And I think journalists like you are in a good position to kind of explore that question.
Yeah, we've been looking into reaching out to folks like that and figuring out, because Stephen and I really try to walk the center here. We're not really about, leaning to one side or the other. And it's really just trying to bring more voices to the table, because if we don't do that, and a lot of the discussions that we've had thus far, and we're not even 2 years into this project and this podcast, the overwhelming majority of people are saying we need both sides. And there are ranchers, there are hunters, there are people that we know that are on the side of compromise and are on the side of working together to make sure that both ways of life can coexist. Because if we can't do that, we're going to, again, the polar ends and the polar opposites aren't going to make this thing work. It's really going to be those people coming in the center to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And there's actually a great book that I would recommend to you guys and to your listeners called Large Carnivore Conservation. Susan Clark is the editor. It's a series of case studies in dealing with sort of the social conflict related to large carnivore conservation and management. And one of the key points that she and her co-authors make is that in order to advance carnivore conservation in a way that minimizes conflict, social conflict, is that you have to identify common ground amongst these different groups. And you're not going to be able to satisfy everybody, but hopefully you're going to be able to have sort of like a center of gravity that's big enough to bring in enough folks that identify as having a common goal, that they have that they all think that it's okay to have wolves on the landscape, for example. Okay. Or they all think that we ought to reduce wolf predation on livestock. I mean, there are certain things that a large group of people can agree on, and then you work out from there. There's an organization in Montana called the Blackfoot Challenge, for example. I believe that's a case study that she and her co-authors highlight in the book, that deal with very practical projects to minimize conflict with wolves and other carnivores. What do? They have range riders that patrol the herds because wolves are intimidated by people in general. It's by having people on horseback that scares the wolves away. Another really important thing that they do is they coordinate the removal of livestock carcasses from the fields and farms of ranchers and puts them in a central and fenced compost area. So those carcasses don't serve as attractants to wolves and bears on these ranches and farms, right? So there's, these are practical projects that can reduce conflict and that can bring people together to achieve a common goal, which in this case is wolf conservation and minimizing livestock depredation. So there are opportunities, there are ideas for how to move forward and get past the polarization. But as that book makes clear, it's not easy, right? And it takes commitment and it also takes trust between these different groups to work together.
I imagine if we were to talk to everyone, that we would find that there are very small differences between how everyone is thinking of this, and those are just getting completely blown out of proportion. And that people really just want tools to handle this. They want to feel like, well, if we're going to honor that folks want wolves in the landscape, then I at least want to be honored with the tools and the resources to at least manage if my farm or my cattle are being disproportionately targeted. And I think it's about tools and about listening to each other and making sure everyone has what they need to get through challenges like this. But I think the differences are probably smaller than we think, and that they're being made out to be.
I think one of the key sources of disagreement that underlies a lot of the conflict is ideas about where wolves should be and where they should not be. And that is really driving a lot of the conflict and the litigation and so forth, because there are individuals and organizations that say, well, we ought to have wolves across their entire historic range in the lower 48 United States.
Which is what, like New York City?
Yeah, I know.
It's basically the entire lower 48 for them.
Basically every state. Yeah,
wolves can be anywhere. And just as an aside, guys, you've got wolves in Europe that live in cornfields, or they come into town at night and feed at garbage dumps. Wolves are not wilderness animals. They're incredibly adaptive and can deal with all kinds of conditions. So, you had a wolf. You probably know this. You had a wolf near Tehachapi Pass not too long ago that got shot, I think, or hit by a car or something. So you can have wolves in lots of places, including in Southern California, if you let them. And see, that's the key question is, where can we let wolves be and where are they going to be a chronic source of conflict? And I think that is a discussion that really needs to be had amongst these different groups and has to be done more sort of collaboratively and less through a process of litigation, which is where we basically are at now. The recent relisting of wolves has basically said, well, wolves are endangered outside the Northern Rockies, which means that technically it's okay for them to go anywhere and we're not going to mess with them unless they are endangering human life. And that's not practical, because there are places that it is just not a good idea for either humans or wolves to have wolves there. That's just the reality of it. But there are other places where it's perfectly fine, or at least it's fine enough that we can mitigate any issues that are there with respect to livestock. So I in some ways, I think that there needs to be sort of a summit about wolves and agreements across the board about where it's okay to have wolves and where it's not okay. And we just need to agree on that. And then once we agree on that, then we can deal with wolves in those different areas, take them out from where we've agreed that they shouldn't be and manage them in those areas where we agree that they can be. That's my view in terms of what needs to be dealt with. or how it should be done.
Yeah, and it's a big deal. It's a big deal that, you know, a little agreement or a small amount of common ground just goes a really long way to making everybody feel like they're part of the conversation and they're being heard. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know. My perception as of the episodes we've done so far is that is the major problem. It's just people feeling like things are being forced on them, that they're not 100% included in it, that they don't have any say, they can't even voice their concerns.
Yes.
And we're trying our best to make a place for that, but you know, it's a journey.
Well, so let me just elaborate on that point, because that's key. So a big point that Susan Clark makes in that book is a problem with large carnivore conservation and management is a problem of governance. In other words, people who don't hunt big game, their voices aren't being heard in terms of the management of wolves and other large carnivores to the extent the voices of the big game hunters are being heard. And there are structural and legal reasons for that. Specifically, these agencies that are managing wolves, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, you know, Wyoming Fish and Game, those agencies are largely funded by dollars from hunting licenses, fishing licenses. They're also being funded by excise taxes on firearms and ammunition. Okay, the Pittman-Robertson Act that goes back to 1937.
And everyone should research that to some degree, that the Pittman-Robertson Act.
Yeah, like $800 million, I believe, annually from, and these are people that are buying a pistol that aren't hunting. Money's and that money is being used to, for example, to pay for most of Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks wolf management program. So you have a fairly small slice of society that is paying for these programs, and as a result, they have an outsized influence on the decision making. You know, hunters feel as if like, well, they have a greater stake in what's going on out there because they're paying the hunting licenses, they're paying these taxes, etc. And so there are structural reasons that lead to this inequality in voices that you're referring to. You know, so it's not as democratic as it should be, and I think that that's part of the sort of package of solutions that needs to be considered for resolving some of this conflict and moving forward. The solutions is adjusting the structures and the laws so more voices are actually heard, voices that carry as much weight as these traditional voices.
Everything you've spoken about today is, you know, needs to be placed out there. And obviously we were thrilled that you were able to be available to come on. You were actually recommended by one of the Yellowstone scientists that we interviewed beforehand. So this is all stuff that we want to get out there. What's your Twitter feed, your Twitter handle? Where can people get some of these articles, these papers, the work that you do with the MacNulty Animal Ecology Lab, stuff like that, so people can see this work in real time so they can get all this information?
Sure. So my Twitter handle is at Dan MacNulty. So DAN, capital D, and then capital MacNulty. And as it turns out, there's a bunch of Dan MacNultys out there. I think I'm the only one that's dealing with wolves. And so you'll find me pretty easily, but it's at Dan MacNulty. And so that's the Twitter feed. And then my website, my university or my Utah State University website, that has information that has like all the research articles that I've been involved in. You can download those from my website. If you just Googled, MacNulty Animal Ecology Lab and go to the publication tab, you'll see all the different publications listed there, and folks are welcome to download those primary articles if they're interested. And then the other place I would really suggest folks go if they want to know more about Yellowstone wolves is the Yellowstone National Park Wolf Project website. There's a ton of information there that the folks at the Wolf Project post. And so that's another great source of information specific on wolves. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks website is outstanding to get an understanding of wolves sort of statewide in Montana and also other wildlife species. They do a great job of posting that information as well.
If anyone wants to reference that article we talked about in the very beginning and that we referenced a few weeks ago, look up Virginia Morell on science.org, and the article is called Massive Wolf Kill Disrupts Long-Running Study of Yellowstone Park Packs. Very interesting article. You should definitely give that one a look.
Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing we want to ask you, Dan, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I guess, that's a tough one, you guys. The first thing that comes to my mind, oh man, no, I'm not
a time or a place or
Yellowstone comes to mind, because that's been sort of the center of my solar system with respect to wolves for going on 30 years. And so Yellowstone and wolves go hand in hand for me.
Everybody listen, we're going to have Dan's Twitter handle in the info. We're going to have his website there. Check out the books that he's co-authored. We'll have those in there too. I believe you can get them on Amazon and all those other places, right, Dan?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. And listen, follow Dan on his Twitter feed. Get, a lot of interesting stuff. The info is there. It needs to get out there. And Dan, you're welcome back anytime. If anything new breaks in the West with these three states, especially if they get special protections put back on by the ESA, if that comes down the pike, or whatever's going on in Colorado, we'd love to have you back on and discuss all that stuff.
Outstanding. No, I really enjoyed talking to you and Stephen, and I'd be happy to speak with you in the future as the story continues to develop.
Yeah, awesome. And before you go, on this Yellowstone Wolves cover, where'd that photo come from? Do you know?
Well, so my colleague and friend, Dan Staler, who's the Wolf Project biologist in Yellowstone, he took that photo, and I believe it's of a pack of wolves, possibly in Pelican Valley. I should know the specifics of that. He's taken so many great photos of wolves over the years, I get them mixed up. And the specifics might actually be on the jacket cover, possibly, but I think it might be the Molly's pack in Pelican Valley.
No, that photo's incredible. Yeah. I know Steven's a photographer, so he's always looking for that, always look for that shot and where it comes from. It's so awesome. Dan MacNulty, this is great. Awesome. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. And everybody follow Dan, and we'll have all that info up for you. So until next time, how's to all of you, and we'll speak with you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.